question really, James, is if we're to continue testing ourselves on this epic scale, I mean, healthy people sticking swabs up their nose and in the back of their throats on a daily basis to check if they're healthy. And obviously, quite often, it comes back not necessarily with an accurate reading, but with a positive result. More and more people, we've got 1.3 million people currently self-isolating and rising. If we're to carry on like this, with this manic testing, we're never going to get out of this, are we?
We're not. It's a Mobius loop of uncertainty. And I think there's been a lot of scaremongering that's cultivated this about, variants and about, aspects about protecting the NHS. But we're at a situation whereby, and I think you touched on this last night, and I have to admit I stole your line on Twitter.
You're welcome.
We're now
You'll be hearing from my lawyers.
I've been there before. We're now in a case whereby it's not about off sick, it's about off well.
Yes.
And so we're in a situation, it's not like last January. I mean, I've always been against lockdowns, but last January I could see the argument when there's almost 2,000 people dying a day.
Absolutely.
And the hospitals were full. I got it, but my argument was about collateral damages. But this one, there is no data argument. It's not about following the science now. It's about following the data. We've got enough data to compare and contrast other countries and also other waves. And right now, we're in a situation whereby there's a few people going to hospital with this, but it's about a quarter where we were last January. So we're in a situation whereby we're in a much better place to where we were last year. The scaremongering has to stop. And what was reassuring, actually, from some of the comments from Javid and Boris and even Chris Whitty yesterday, is that they were even alluding to the fact that we've got to learn to live with this now. And so therefore the media also need to learn to live with this. And therefore that's transferred onto the public. And so we're in a situation whereby what's remaining in this crisis is not even so much about the government, because it seems a bit of a narrative change with the government. The issue is about what SAGE are saying and what SAGE are then saying into the media, and the media are pumping it out. I mean, if you look at, and we're going to touch on this in a bit, but if you look at what happened a few weeks ago, where SAGE was saying in their worst case scenario, 6,000 people would die in January. And we're now in a situation where today, I think it was just over 300 yesterday.
Yeah, they said 2 million COVID cases a day, potentially by New Year, and potentially 6,000 deaths a day by mid-January, as you say. And what was it? Yesterday's was about 45 or something.
Yeah. So
they're clearly not going to hit that target. I mean, the thing is, I think the problem with SAGE is this. In a sense, they're doing their job. They have defined their job as catastrophizing the worst case scenario, to warn the government about the worst case scenario. But that leads to the government getting spooked and bringing in restrictions, ordering mass testing on a manic scale, because they're frightened of these worst case scenarios. And I think we have to retreat from our fear of this catastrophizing that we get from the scientific community.
Yes, one thing leads on to another. So you get these modeling examples, and then various representatives of SAGE pump the airwaves or TV stations or print media with their catastrophizing worst case scenarios. And then it's fueled out into the public. So the public end up getting spooked again. So one thing leads to another. But this, as I said earlier, is very, very different. So we've got a situation whereby a number of things aren't working anymore. So first of all, as we touched on before, the mass testing, and then the pingdemic that goes around that. So you get a situation where people are mildly ill, staying off, and then people who are not even ill, staying off. They might be asymptomatic, or because they've been pinged because someone else they've come in contact with has got ill. So you end up having 1 million people from our workforce off ill. That's one problem. The second problem, well, allegedly off ill. The second problem is about the issues with the data and SAGE. How can we get to a situation, and SAGE have been repeatedly wrong for about a year now in terms of their modelling.
The modelling has been inaccurate, to say the least, yes.
It's been terrible, and that fuels a lot of the scaremongering. It becomes that Mobius loop over and over again. This situation is very, very different to where we were a year ago. And I think there's an argument now, because Johnson, he's taking a look at opinion polls. And it's interesting that basically the opinion polls went 5% back in favour of the Tories when he didn't increase the restrictions over the Christmas period.
Yeah.
Johnson's only ideology, as far as I'm no Johnson fan, but his only ideology seems to be about public mood. And I think he's assessed that the public mood right now is for no more restrictions, because I think the public... they've had to deal with a lot, but they've seen that this bit.
Yeah, we're at that stage where I think millions of people have just had enough. And don't forget, the government has kind of fueled itself throughout the crisis on this polling that seemed to magically reveal that the vast majority were in favour of lockdowns and social distancing and shut the pubs. So they kind of were inspired on by those kind of polls, and guess what? Boris, remarkably, has just finally realised that actually what people want is their freedom back. They want their freedom of choice. They want their freedom to go down the pub. And when he allowed them to do that at Christmas, guess what? His popularity went back. It's not rocket science, really, is it?
Well, it's all about politics. I mean, I'm actually quite optimistic about this year because Johnson has held his nerve. They even said last night that they're optimistic there'll be no more restrictions, but that's just England. You look what's happening in Europe, where so many countries, it appears that they've lost their minds. Same with Canada, same with the continued situation in Australia and New Zealand. But it's also within our own four nations, within one nation. So you've got, for instance, what's happening with Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland versus England. The data is pretty comparable across those four nations. But whenever Johnson says something, this has been going on for quite a while, whenever Johnson says something in terms of where we are at with the restrictions, it seems that Sturgeon, for instance, has to be a little bit more heavy-handed with the restrictions. That's not about what is the right thing to do about public health and staying safe. That's just politics. It's almost point scoring. Yeah. But I think we're in a situation where the mood has turned in England, whereby a lot of people are just looking at the data rather than the science and going, well, we're in a very different situation to a year ago. We shouldn't have any more restrictions. It is time we learn to live with this. You combine with the vaccine rollout as well, which means we're in a very different position to where we were a year ago, plus the hospitalizations rate from this variant. And it's nothing like where we were last January. And the SAGE modelling has to stop. And if Johnson wants to get even more authority on this issue, and it seems to be he's moving in that direction, there's an argument that he needs to literally disband and ignore SAGE. Well, because every single aspect of modelling of SAGE over the last few months has been wildly wrong, and yet still our media are fueling the public with these misplaced SAGE models.
Yes, and too many members of SAGE are rather keen on their media appearances. So you've got these kind of, suddenly, you know, Neil Ferguson crops up and says one thing, and then you'll get Patrick Vallance saying another thing. The interviews these people give are, you know, kind of constant and often giving different stories. I mean, you know, if the government feels that SAGE should continue and SAGE should continue to make their models, fine. I mean, I wouldn't encourage them to form that conclusion, but if they want to, fine. Boris has, over the past couple of weeks, finally shown that he has got the mettle to resist their doomsday predictions. So they say 2 million cases by the end of December, 6,000 deaths a day by the middle of January. He said, I don't see that the statistics back that up. Therefore, Christmas and New Year is back on. And good, let's be fair, credit where it's due. Good for him. He's been vindicated.
Yeah, it wasn't just even that. It was also that some of the other aspects have been largely forgotten about, but it's really interesting. So almost for the first time ever, he was talking about collateral damages of lockdowns. He was talking about the impact on mental health. He was talking about the backlog of non-COVID treatments. He was talking about kids needing to be in school. He was talking about the decimation of various industries, in particular hospitality and travel. That's a good sign. He was not saying that a few months ago. They were putting up, you know, they're literally turning a blind eye to this stuff. Yeah. But he was saying something that he hasn't said before, that we need to look at COVID in the whole. It's not, and this is my argument about it, it's not just about cases, hospitalizations and deaths around COVID. It's about all the collateral damages. And then you start having a proper conversation in the round. And Johnson was beginning to go there in that direction last night. And that was, for me, quite heartening.
Yeah, as an overview, I've said this before, but if you look at the technicalities of this crisis now, we have a government, busting its backside to protect the nation from catching a new variant, a meek and mild variant that will make them feel a bit rough for a couple of days, and millions of people who get it won't even know. So the government is now protecting us from a mild illness that is, the chances of it killing you are vanishingly small, and the chances of you ending up in hospital are pretty small as well. So they're protecting us from a mild illness. Here's what worries me, though, is the new kind of problem is this obsession with testing. And let's just have a listen so as many of us are sitting here saying, we can't carry on testing each other like this. This is getting ridiculous. Let's have a listen to the Prime Minister last night.
We've identified 100,000 critical workers in areas from food processing to transport to our border force. And from the 10th of January, we'll be rolling out lateral flow testing for all these workers, available on every working day. We'll be sending testing kits directly to these organisations and liaising with them on the logistics.
So once again, his solution to what we are seeing as a problem of over-testing is more testing. The next mindset, the problem always, all through this crisis, seems to be, to me, to have been a kind of mindset of the government. So we've got, I'm not necessarily knocking their mindset. They were obsessed with the vaccine. They became obsessed with the second jab, very obsessed with the booster, and now they're obsessed with testing. So it's with each new obsession, you have to kind of try and hope that they'll grow out of it. But right now, this testing thing is kind of oppressive, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's just causing so many people to be off work. It's almost like a lockdown within a lockdown based on testing for what is largely a mild illness, a kind of flu at worst, cold most likely, a set of symptoms, where if people have 2 or 3 days off work and that's it, or some people just not even ill at all. We can't use that as the model. And it's interesting that certain aspects of the media have always manipulated the data about worst case scenario data to scare people. So right back at the start in April, it was about percentages of deaths because there wasn't tests out in the community. It was only in the hospitals. So it was saying things like 14% death rate because the only tests were in hospitals where people are seriously ill. Then the model changed into the waves of April and then January this year about overall deaths per day. And now it's because that it doesn't apply anymore. It's now about cases. Cases are not the model, especially on this variant where it's much milder. And so therefore the model should be about what the government said for the last few months about hospitalizations and deaths and about strain on the NHS. Mm. The other aspect that's never discussed about this is about, if we're talking about COVID in the whole, is about excess home deaths, which at the end of last year were over 75,000 excess home deaths, of which around 80% were higher than 80%, about 88% were non-COVID deaths. And then the other aspect of this is about the backlog of non-COVID treatments, so for instance, cancer treatments and so on. They need to be discussed. And what I want is the government to take a step back from this and go, if we're going to talk about COVID and solutions, everything needs to be taken into account. What is the capacity of the NHS? How do we have more NHS beds? And over the last few months during the pandemic, 5,000 NHS beds have been cut in England. So therefore, we need to have a conversation about why that has happened. We need to have a conversation about staffing levels in the NHS. Whatever happened to the Nightingales? What about the backlog of treatments? What about, we've got over 1 million people in our workforce that are staying at home for mild symptoms in a lot of cases. It's back to front. It's crass logic. And we're not going to get out of this crisis until the government get on the front foot and get ahead of the virus by providing solutions that get us through this and get us back to normal. At the moment, as you said, they seem to be moving from one obsession to another.
Yeah, and no wonder desperate businesses are begging Boris to, at the very least, amend and change the isolation rules to shorten the isolation time, because as things stand, I mean, it was 10 days, it's come down to 7 days, but that is still ruinous for many, many businesses and indeed the NHS.